gentle viewers. In today's video, we're taking a look at one of my favorite obsessions, books. And I have some lovely vintage ones that I picked up at recent, what we call garage sales. But I also wanted to show you this lovely book bag. This was a gift from one of my sisters who currently lives in the UK. And this image, again, she also knows my obsession with typewriters. But this whole series are reprints of patents for things that actually never were created. So this is of a typewriter that, again, was never manufactured. And the company, let's see if I've still got the tag. They're called Quote Totes. And it is from a company called Green Bananas Eco Products. And yeah, I love the name Quote Totes. So before we look at the vintage books, I wanted to share with you a current read that I am quite enjoying. And this book A Summer of Witches, a Molly Morgan adventure by M. Gnendron, is actually written by a gentle viewer. Now she contacted me via email, and we actually purchased each other's books. Because if you are a writer, you will know that getting a review on Amazon helps to get your book noticed. And they need to be verified purchases. So we agreed. I purchased hers, she purchased mine. And this is such a lovely read. It's actually a young adult book, but just like many young adult books out there, it also appeals to readers of any age. So I'm just going to read you the back to give you a quick synopsis of the story. Wartime witches, ghosts, and smugglers abound in this dual-time supernatural mystery story, exploring the rumor that a coven of New Forest witches played a part in Britain's World War II victory. In the summer of 1940, 12-year-old Lawrence and Rachel are evacuated to the village of Burley. One night, they witness a group of people dressed in strange clothing creeping into the woods. Before long, they find themselves drawn into an adventure while the very future of their country is at stake. In 1990, teenagers Nick and Molly uncover a diary in the attic which belonged to Molly's grandmother, who had been evacuated to Burley 50 years before. The diary hints at extraordinary events, but creates more questions than answers, before coming to an abrupt end as they are drawn further into danger, can Nick and Molly find out what really happened in 1940? Now, doesn't that sound intriguing? What I also really enjoyed about this book was the characters Lawrence and Rachel back in 1940 and Nick and Molly in the 1990s. The friendships that develop between both groups of children under extraordinary circumstances. And I love the fact that the characters are not immediately kindred spirits, and how that we can find common ground and acceptance if we just get to know each other better. So I highly recommend this, A Summer of Witches, and I'll put a link to her book in my description box. And what's really funny is, again, if you're new to my channel, you may not be aware that I am also obviously a writer. And I've published 3 books so far, and I only have in my possession 2. Yes, I don't even own. I keep giving them away. So this is my very first one, A Still Life of Hannah Morgan. And then I'm currently writing a series, or a trilogy, I should say. So I do have the Raven Witch Trilogy, Book 1, The Enchanted One, published, but I also have Book 2, which is The Witch of Rose Cottage, which is also available. Again, I just don't own a copy of my own book. I know that sounds ridiculous. But I also wanted to give a shout out to a couple of other lovely viewers, because if you are a writer, you know that it is a labor of love. It is years in the making, and then after you've done that, the road to publishing can also take time, and many of us have to develop a thick skin as we go through the whole query process, which can involve quite a bit of rejection. So, to a couple of my viewers, to the first one, she's also a supporter on my Patreon page. Shout out to Phyllis JH. She writes historical fiction, and she is just beginning her journey to get the first novel published, so I'm wishing her well. And the second is a wonderful person that, again, left me a message on my Facebook page, and that's Jennifer H. And she is writing nonfiction in more of the spiritual vein. So again, just sending out to all of you who have chosen to pursue that wonderful experience of writing. I am sending you much love and understanding, and best wishes on your writing journey. So again, if you love to read and that description of A Summer of Witches sounds intriguing to you, I encourage you to check it out. And so, when I just realized with that first book, it kind of ties into my love of vintage, because of the time period it's set in. So, let's take the rest of this video to look at some of our vintage books and just enjoy the sounds of paper And I think I will maybe read out a few passages from some of my favorite finds. So now I like to take a look at some of my most recent vintage book finds. And as you can see, they are not necessarily in the best condition. But there is something about a well-loved book that just makes me smile. And I didn't do this on purpose, but I love the soft, almost beach-like or watery colors in the covers, from the blue to the cream to a darker blue and this lovely green. So I picked up, and those of you who are my patrons will probably smile when you see this one. The Secret Garden. This one is a young mutineer. This is a reader. Black Beauty, a collection of poems by Byron. And over here we have a Beatrix Potter book. This one is another reader. And this is The Lamplighter. So why don't we take a look at some of them a little closer up. Now this first one is from one of my most favorite authors when I was a wee one. And this is a Beatrix Potter book, and it's the Tale of the Pie and the Patty Pan. And if you've ever read her books, what I enjoyed so much was the size of them. They're the perfect size for little hands. And how glossy the pages are where her artwork is showcased. And in this one, it's Ribby the cat and Duchess the dog. And if you have read anything about Beatrix Potter and her life, A lot of her later books, the images that you see, are actually from her farmhouse garden. And it's just a sweet little story about a slight confusion over a pie. So have any of you, when you were little, did you fall in love with any of the Beatrix Potter books? If so, you'll have to let me know what your favorites were. What a gorgeous picture. So yes, as soon as I saw this one, I had to get it. It says, "Where is the pie made of mouse?" Because of course Duchess wanted to come over and have tea with her friend, but the idea of eating mouse pie was something that she just couldn't deal with. And I love that old range that she's cooking on. There's a little teapot. It says, "Duchess in the porch." And to me, reading is not just about falling into the story. It's about how a real book engages all of the senses. The sound of the pages being turned, the smell of ink on paper, the feel of the pages beneath your fingertips, the weight of the book as you hold it in your hand. What does this one say? "Where is the patty pan?" Thought I missed a page there. Dr. Maggoty's mixture. And we have a magpie. We don't have magpies out here, but when I lived in Alberta, they were one of my favorite birds. Looking down at the broken pie dish, and she says, "So there really was a patty pan." So Ribby stared with amazement. Did you ever see the like? So there really was a patty pan. But my patty pans are all in the kitchen cupboard. Well, I never did. Next time I want to give a party, I will invite Cousin Tabitha. Twitch it. Sort of reminds me when you have a dinner party and you invite people that have very specific dietary needs. And it makes making dinner a challenge. And so on the back are some of her characters from other books. So I think the next one I would like to look at, of course, would be The Secret Garden. Just because again on my Patreon page, that was the first bedtime story that I read out to everyone. And this, of course, on the front is the ivy that grew in a thick curtain over the garden wall that hid the door to the secret garden. Now, The Secret Garden is written by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And this particular edition was copyrighted by her daughter, Verity, in 1938. And the illustrations, the date on them is 1949. And you really get a sense of the era in which the illustrations were done. And this is just making me smile. Of course, we all know that that is Dickon and Mary Lennox. They're in the secret garden with Dickon's animal friends, the squirrels that like to ride on his shoulder, the fox cub, and the crow, and of course the very important Robin, whom helped Mary find the key to the secret garden. It would have been lovely if I had found this while I was making the recordings, but I'm still happy to have it. And what I like about older books is the font that they use and just the little details. And I can't tell you, gentle viewers, how many times I stumbled over the words Misselthwaite Manor. You can see that this book has been well loved. Mistress Mary quite contrary. Mistress Mary quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. Of course, Mrs. Metlock. Oh, and this is when Mary was on the train. After being orphaned in India, and now she's on her way to Misselthwaite Manor. There they are in the carriage, going across the moor. Oh yes, and this is when she meets Martha, the maid of the house. And they become dear friends, as of course we all know that Martha's brother, one of her many siblings, is Dickon. And there's a picture of her. Such a wonderful story about friendship, magic, about believing in yourself. And there's the old gardener. Who also became their friend. Let's see if we can find a picture of Colin. The cry in the corridor. That's when she first discovers she's not alone in Misselthwaite Manor. There was someone crying, there was. And Mary might have been quite contrary when she first arrived at the manor. But she was also very courageous. And I love this. This is when she is exploring, trying to find out where that cry in the night had come from. And she discovers a little mouse. The key of the garden. And of course the gardener's name was Mr. Weatherstaff. The robin who showed the way. And if by chance you haven't read this, I do urge you to at least try to find a copy in your local library. But there's Mary, after having discovered the key buried deep within the ground. The robin showing her that beneath the curtain of ivy was the door. And there it is, all overgrown. This is where she meets Dickon. he sort of embodies the spirit of nature, of being connected to all that is around you, being in balance, in harmony with Mother Earth. There he is. And he begins to teach her all that he knows about gardening, the cycles of nature. Spend this whole video just looking through this book. See if we can find you a picture of Colin. Oh, there's a good one. And there he is, lying abed, believing that he has a crooked back, that he is too weak to stand, and not long to live. And of course, Mary, who shares very similar traits of behavior, pulls Colin out of his shell. Let's see if we can find some more color illustrations. That's how excited I get. It's like coming back to an old friend. This is where Colin first meets Dickon. And of course, the three of them have the secret garden as their secret. And Mary and Dickon come in every day if they can to talk to him about the mysteries and the magic there and what is beginning to grow as spring turns into summer. And eventually, Colin not only goes out to the secret garden, that is where he gains his strength and begins to walk again. And in this scene, Dickon has brought all of his friends for Colin to see and play with. So we have a baby lamb, or just a lamb. There's one of the squirrels that like to ride on his shoulder. There's the other one peeping out the window, his friend the crow. And I find it so very interesting. I told you the date, so this is a story written in the 30s. And really, if you think about it, Colin's return to health is something that is become sort of trendy now. The whole forest bathing and connecting with nature and gardening. So the old truths and the old wisdoms are now just becoming known again. So in this one, this is where our gardener, Mr. Weatherstaff, is allowed in on the secret of the garden, and they practice walking Colin around until he gains his strength, because his father is, for a lot of reasons, so afraid that his young boy will die. He avoids spending any time with him. And the lovely conclusion of the book is the reunion of father and son. Shall I read a little bit? So this one is chapter 27, In the Garden. In each century since the beginning of the world, wonderful things have been discovered. In the last century, more amazing things were found out than in any century before. In this new century, hundreds of things still more astounding will be brought to light. At first, people refuse to believe that a strange new thing can be done. Then they begin to hope it can be done. Then they see it can be done. Then it is done. And all the world wonders why it was not done centuries ago. One of the new things people began to find out in the last century was that thoughts, just mere thoughts, are as powerful as electric batteries, as good for one as sunlight is, or as bad for one as poison. To let a sad thought or a bad one get into your mind is as dangerous as letting a scarlet fever germ get into your body. If you let it stay there after it has gotten in, you may never get over it as long as you live. Again, a very modern concept that we think that we have somehow invented. So why don't we pick it up here where Mr. Craven, who is Colin's father, has returned home, and he has stopped by Dickens' cottage and is talking to his brothers and sisters. And he says, "Where is Master Colin now?" Mr. Craven asked. "In the garden, sir. He's always in the garden, though not a human creature is allowed to go near it, for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. "In the garden?" he said, and after he had sent Mrs. Medlock away, he stood and repeated it again and again. In the garden. He had to make an effort to bring himself back to the place he was standing in, and when he felt he was on the earth again, he turned and went out of the room. He took his way, as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery, and among the laurels and the fountain beds. The fountain was playing now, and was encircled by beds of brilliant autumn flowers. He crossed the lawn and turned into the long walk by the ivied wall. He did not walk quickly, but slowly, and his eyes were on the path. He felt as if he were being drawn back to the place he had so long forsaken, and he did not know why. As he drew near to it, his step became still more slow. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy hung thick over it, but he did not know exactly where it lay, that buried key. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him, and almost the moment after he had paused, he started and listened, asking himself if he were walking in a dream. The ivy hung thick over the door. The key was buried under the shrubs. No human being had passed that portal for 10 lonely years. And yet, inside the garden there were sounds. There were the sounds of running, scuffling feet, seeming to chase round and round under the trees, there were strange sound of lowered, suppressed voices, exclamations, and smothered cries of joy. It seemed actually like the laughter of young things, the uncontrollable laughter of children who were trying not to be heard, but who in a moment or so, as their excitement mounted, would burst forth. What in heaven's name was he dreaming of? What in heaven's name did he hear? Was he losing his reason and thinking he heard things which were not for human ears? Was it that the far clear voice had meant? And then the moment came, the uncontrollable moment when the sounds forgot to hush themselves. The feet ran faster and faster. They were nearing the garden door. There was a quick, strong young breathing and a wild outbreak of laughing shouts which could not be contained, and the door in the wall was flung wide open, the sheet of ivy swinging back, and a boy burst through it at full speed and, without seeing the outsider, dashed almost into his arms. Mr. Craven had extended them just in time to save him from falling as a result of his unseen dash against him. And when he held him away to look at him in amazement at his being there, he truly gasped for breath. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid color leaping to his face. He threw the thick hair back from the forehead and lifted a pair of strange, gray eyes. Eyes full of boyish laughter and rimmed with black lashes like a fringe. It was the eyes which made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. Who? What? Who? He stammered. This was not what Colin had expected. This was not what he had planned. He had never thought of such a meeting, and yet, to come dashing out, winning a race, perhaps it was even better. He drew himself up to his very tallest. Mary, who had been running with him and had dashed through the door too, believed that he had managed to make himself look taller than he had ever looked before. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin. You can't believe it. I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin." Like Mrs. Metlock, he did not understand what his father meant when he had said hurriedly, "In the garden, in the garden." "Yes," hurried on Colin, "it was the garden that did it, and Mary, and Dickon, and the creatures, and the magic. No one knows. We kept it to tell you when you came. I'm well. I can beat Mary in a race. I'm going to be an athlete." He said it all so like a healthy boy, his face flushed, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness, that Mr. Craven's soul shook with unbelieving joy. Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. "Aren't you glad, Father?" he ended. "Aren't you glad? I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." Mr. Craven put his hands on both the boy's shoulders and held him still. He knew he dared not even try to speak for a moment. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said at last. and tell me all about it." And so they led him in. The place was a wilderness of autumn gold and purple and violet blue and flaming scarlet, and on every side were sheaves of late lilies standing together, lilies which were white or white and ruby. He remembered well when the first of them had been planted, that just at this season of the year their late glories should reveal themselves. Late roses climbed and hung and clustered, and the sunshine, deepening the hue of the yellowing trees, made one feel that one stood in an embowered temple of gold. The newcomer stood silent, just as the children had done when they had come into its grayness. He looked round and round. "I thought it would be dead," he said. "Mary thought so at first," said Colin, "but it came alive." Then they sat down under their tree, all but Colin, who wanted to stand while he told the story. It was the strangest thing he had ever heard, Archibald Craven thought, as it was poured forth in headlong boy fashion. Mystery and magic and wild creatures, the weird midnight meeting, the coming of the spring, the passions of insulted pride which had dragged the young Rajah to his feet to defy old Ben Weatherstaff to his face, the odd companionship, the play acting, the great secret so carefully kept. The listener laughed until tears came into his eyes, and sometimes tears came into his eyes when he was not laughing. The athlete, the lecturer, the scientific discoverer was a laughable, lovable, healthy young human thing. "Now," he said at the end of the story, "it need not be a secret any more. I dare say it will frighten them nearly into fits when they see me, but I am never going to get into that chair again. I shall walk back with you, Father, to the house." Ben Weatherstaff's duties rarely took him away from the gardens, but on this occasion he made an excuse to carry some vegetables to the kitchen, and being invited into the servants' hall by Mrs. Metlock to drink a glass of beer, he was on the spot, as he had hoped to be, when the most dramatic event Misselthwaite Manor had seen during the present generation actually took place. One of the windows looking upon the courtyard gave also a glimpse of the lawn. Mrs. Metlock, knowing Ben had come from the gardens, hoped that he might have caught sight of his master, or even by chance of his meeting with Master Colin. "Did you see either of them, Weatherstaff?" she asked. Ben took his beer mug from his mouth and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Aye, that I did," he answered, with a shrewdly significant air. "Both of them?" suggested Mrs. Metlock. "Both of them," returned Ben Weatherstaff. "Thank ye kindly, ma'am. I could sup on another mug of this." "Together?" said Mrs. Metlock, hastily overfilling his beer mug in her excitement. "Together, ma'am," and Ben gulped down half of his new mug at one gulp. "Where was Master Colin? How did he look? What did they say to each other?" "I dinna hear that," said Ben. along only being of the step-ladder looking over the wall. But I'll tell thee this. There's been things going on outside as your house as people knows not about. And what you'll find out soon. And it was not 2 minutes before he swallowed the last of his beer and waved his monk solemnly toward the window, which took in through the shrubbery a piece of lawn. "Look there," he said, "if that's curious. Look what's coming across the grass." When Mrs. Medlock looked up, she threw up her hands and gave a little shriek, and every man and woman servant within hearing bolted across the servants' hall and stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him. And by his side, with his head up in the air and his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin. The end. Oh, that brought back a lot of lovely memories. Let's see, what's another one we should look at? Maybe Black Beauty. Now this one says Black Beauty by Anna Sewell, and down here it says Herbert Strang's Library. Now this one doesn't have any illustrations, and somebody has cut out the first page, and this has been copyrighted in 1944. Shall I just read out the first chapter of this one? Black Beauty, Part 1, Chapter 1, My Early Home. The first place that I can well remember was a large, pleasant meadow with a pond of clear water in it. Some shady trees leaned over it, and rushes and water lilies grew at the deep end. Over the hedge on one side, we looked into a ploughed field, and on the other we looked over a gate at our master's house, which stood by the roadside. At the top of the meadow was a plantation of fir trees, and at the bottom a running brook overhung by a steep bank. Whilst I was young, I lived upon my mother's milk, as I could not eat grass. In the daytime I ran by her side, and at night I lay down close to her. When it was hot, we used to stand by the pond in the shade of the trees, and when it was cold, we had a nice warm shed near the plantation. As soon as I was old enough to eat grass, my mother used to go out to work in the daytime and came back in the evenings. There were 6 young colts in the meadow beside me. They were older than I was. Some were nearly as large as grown-up horses. I used to run with them and had great fun. We used to gallop all together around and round the field as hard as we could go. Sometimes we had rather rough play, for they would frequently bite and kick as well as gallop. One day, when there was a good deal of kicking, my mother whinnied to me to come to her, and then she said, "I wish you to pay attention to what I am going to say to you. The colts who live here are very good colts, but they are cart horse colts, and, of course, they have not learned manners. You have been well bred and well born. Your father was a great name in these parts, and your grandfather won the cup 2 years at the Newmarket races. Your grandmother had the sweetest temper of any horse I ever knew, and I think you have never seen me kick or bite. I hope you will grow up gentle and good, and never learn bad ways. Do your work with a good will, lift your feet up well when you trot, and never bite or kick, even in play. I have never forgotten my mother's advice. I knew she was a wise old horse, and our master thought a great deal of her. Her name was Duchess, but he often called her Pet. Our master was a good, kind man. He gave us good food, good lodgings, and kind words. He spoke as kindly to us as he did to his little children. We were all fond of him, and my mother loved him very much. When she saw him at the gate, she would neigh with joy and trot up to him. He would pat and stroke her and say, "Well, old Pet, how is your little darky?" I was a dull black, so he called me Darky. Then he would give me a piece of bread, which was very good, and sometimes he brought a carrot for my mother. All the horses would come to him, but I think we were his favorites. My mother always took him to the town on market day in a light gig. There was a ploughboy, Dick, who sometimes came into our field to pluck blackberries from the hedge. When he'd eaten all he wanted, he would have what he called fun with the colts, throwing stones and sticks at them to make them gallop. We did not much mind him, for we could gallop off, but sometimes a stone would hit and hurt us. One day he was at this game and did not know that the master was in the next field, but he was there, watching what was going on. Over the hedge he jumped in a snap, and catching Dick by the arm, he gave him such a box on the ear as made him roar with pain and surprise. As soon as we saw the master, we trotted up near to see what went on. "Bad boy," he said, "bad boy, to chase colts. This is not the first time, nor the second, but it shall be the last. There, take your money and go home. I shall not want you on my farm again." So we never saw Dick any more. Old Daniel, the man who looked after the horses, was just as gentle as our master. So we were well off. So how many of you read this book as a child? And I remember the first time I read this, I was fascinated because I'd never come across a book that described a story from an animal's point of view. I mean, it's different with Beatrix Potter because that is almost like a fairy tale where all animals interact with each other, whereas this one is the tale of the horse as it goes through different owners, some good, some very, very bad. Yes, this is a lovely one. So you'll have to let me know if you've read this one. So I think I have time for one more book. And I think we'll dip into the book of poetry. this copy of Byron's poetry is illustrated. And just look at that lovely detail on the cover. And this has obviously been loved a lot. The binding's actually coming apart, but that didn't stop me. And again, all these books were $1 and $2. So this one there is an advertisement, which I think is kind of funny at the beginning. And look at how yellow the pages are. It says, instead of an excuse, the publishers have to offer a congratulations to the public upon being enabled by the lapse of copyrights to add most of the poetical works of Byron to their cheap but elegant series of her most esteemed poets. This volume contains all Lord Byron's poems, of which the copyright is free, with the exception of Don Juan, from which extraordinary work as it is, their wish that their books should be welcome to every family circle, they have only presented carefully selected, beautiful passages with which English readers, and so well acquainted that they should naturally look for them. Look at how tiny the print is. Find you an illustration. Even by today's lighting and my reading glasses on. Oh, there's one. Writing his poems in this typeface is quite challenging. I do like the way these pages sound. They're much thinner. And they crackle a bit. But again, I'm oddly fascinated by how tiny that print is. Shall I find us a short poem? Although I don't know if I can actually read it out, just because of the lighting that I like to use. What about this one? There was a time I need not name. There was a time I need not name, since it will ne'er forgotten be, when all our feelings were the same, as still my soul hath been to thee. And from that hour, when first thy tongue confessed a love which equalled mine, though many a grief my heart hath wrung, unknown and thus unfelt by thine. None hath sunk so deep as this, to think how all that love hath flown, transient as ever faithless kiss, but transient in thy breast alone. And yet my heart some soul anew, when late I heard thy lips declare, in accounts once imagined true, remembrance of the days that were. Yes, my adored, yet most unkind, though thou wilt never love again, to me 'tis doubly sweet to find remembrance of that love remain. Yes, 'tis a glorious thought to me. No longer shall my soul repine. Whatever thou art, or ever shall be, thou hast been dearly, solely mine. So I'm just curious, do you prefer to read fiction, non-fiction? Do you dip occasionally into poetry? And I find with poetry, it's almost like eating something that's incredibly rich and delicious, where you can just have one tiny morsel and you savor it on your tongue and just not overdo it, just that one dip in and let those words sink in, contemplate. So yeah, this is quite a lovely crinkly book, actually. So I'll put this back. I see I haven't done it in the order that I originally had them set up. I'll just slip this one in here. There we go. So, gentle viewers, I hope you enjoyed the selective show and tell of some of my most recent vintage book finds. And until we meet again, may you have sweet dreams and a peaceful